The court case we are going to be covering is Brown versus Board of Education, a landmark Supreme Court case that took place in 1954. To understand the ramifications of Brown versus Board of Education, it's important to know the circumstances from which the case arose and the facts therein. Throughout the South, the segregation of African Americans and white citizens was both legal and rampant during the years preceding the case. The public school system was no exception. In Topeka, Kansas, where the events of Brown versus Board took place, all elementary schools were completely segregated, and all high schools were partially segregated. In 1951, the public schools of Topeka, Kansas refused to allow the Reverend Oliver Brown's daughter, Linda Brown, along with 12 other African American children, admittance to the elementary school that was closest to them, instead forcing them to travel a longer distance to an all-black segregated school. The Reverend Oliver Brown filed a class action lawsuit in federal court on their behalf. The district court ruled in favor of the Board of Education, citing as precedent Plessy versus Ferguson. The district court stated that Topeka's segregation was consistent with the separate but equal doctrine established by the case. Unwilling to accept this defeat, Brown appealed to the Supreme Court case with the help of Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP. In the image on the left, we see Oliver Brown and Linda Brown's mother, along with two other parents of the 12 children that were refused admittance to the nearest school. On the top right, we see some of the many protests that were going on in favor of the NAACP and against segregation, as it was widely unpopular among the African American community for obvious reasons. In the bottom right photograph, we see Linda Brown herself, and this shows us the scale of this case and all of this happening around one small little girl. Related constitutional clauses and laws. The 14th Amendment was very relevant to this case, especially because of its Equal Protection Clause, which stated, and I quote, "No state shall deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." Additionally, we see the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This law states that all persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall be entitled to the full and equal enjoyment of the accommodations, advantages, facilities, and privileges of inns, public conveyances on land or water, theaters, and other places of public amusement, subject only to the conditions and limitations established by law, and applicable alike to citizens of every race and color, regardless of any previous condition of servitude. However, the Civil Rights of 1875, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, would later be overturned in a following case. As prior mentioned, the civil rights cases were a consolidation of 5 cases that overturned the Civil Rights of 1875. The Supreme Court ruled that the 10th Amendment gave reserved power to the states, and therefore the national government could not force states to desegregate. Additionally, Plessy v. Ferguson, which was also previously mentioned, was another Supreme Court case, a very infamous Supreme Court case that established the separate but equal doctrine that upheld the legality of segregation despite the 14th Amendment. In this case, the Supreme Court stated that facilities can be both separate and equal, meaning that we can separate based on race as long as the quality was equal. Additionally, Pearson versus Murray and Sweat versus Painter are both lawsuits against schools for denying admittance of Black students, specifically in higher education, being college and law school. Although both cases resulted in the schools being forced to admit Black students, none of them overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, as they were ruled on the basis that the facilities were separate and unequal, not that being separate was inherently unequal.
All right, so some of the arguments for the Board of Education of Topeka were that they claimed that the schools had similar and therefore equal educational facilities, just adjusted for different students' needs. For example, they argued that white students probably felt more comfortable in a learning environment with other white students, and Black students probably felt more comfortable in a learning environment with other Black students. And they also argued that education is a reserved power that should be left entirely to the states. and therefore that the federal government had no right to be involved at all. And they also pointed out that the segregated housing of Topeka conflicted with the desegregation of schools, where students might have to travel very far in order to go to a different school if the government were to force desegregation. And some of the arguments for Brown were obviously that the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection, and therefore discrimination and segregation are unconstitutional. And also the notion that separate is inherently unequal. There is no way to promise completely equal education in different segregated schools. And often there's the issues of like funding and others that make the schools very unequal. And they also point out that there have been successful examples of desegregation elsewhere in Topeka. And so it is very possible, and therefore the school had no like excuse. And then obviously the lack of morality in segregating schools. And so the decision was unanimous in favor of Brown, overturning the separate but equal doctrine established in Plessy v. Ferguson in public education. And the Chief Justice Earl Warren delivered the opinion, emphasizing the importance of education as a right to all people. He spoke of how segregation leads to feelings of inferiority in African American children and also upheld feelings of superiority in white children, and that separate educational facilities were, as Brown argued, inherently unequal. So the aftermath of this case was quite complicated, just because there was so much pushback against it from white people in the South specifically. And Brown v. Board of Education 2 was the unanimous court decision to place local school authorities in charge of desegregating their own unique schools, and ordered federal trials to oversee desegregation with, quote, all deliberate speed, which is pretty vague wording. And so the Little Rock Nine, I'm sure you've heard of them, they were at the forefront of resistance to desegregation. And so the first 9 African American students at the Little Rock Nine High School, the Little Rock High School, faced an angry and violent white mob on their first day, and troops had to be deployed. It was a really big deal. And so the school board sued in Cooper v. Aaron, asking for the desegregation to be postponed for 2.5 years. But the Supreme Court denied this request and reinstated that the schools must comply with court orders. And in response, the governor just shut down all public schools completely, and they set up a system that subsidized white students' private and segregated education with grants. So there was like no public schooling for 2 or 3 years in Topeka, which leads us to Griffin v. Prince Edward County, where similar resistance happened in Virginia. And the Supreme Court held that this was not allowed under the 14th Amendment and said that, quote, the time for mere deliberate speed has run out, and that phrase can no longer justify denying school children their constitutional rights. So, Brown v. Board was one of the first major victories of the civil rights movement, and it set the precedent for desegregation all across America, and its legacy is widely remembered today. And this is our bibliography, and thank you for listening.